On a freezing New Year's Eve in the heart of London, Sir Edric Woottone, the stoic Duke of Northmore, did the one thing he had spent his entire life avoiding. He didn't mean to notice her. He never intended to ruin his reputation by carrying a fainted woman through the midnight frost. And he certainly never imagined he would lose his heart to the mysterious stranger who collapsed against his chest just as the clock struck 12. But when she finally opened her eyes the next morning within the silent walls of his estate, she wasn't just a girl in a burgundy cloak. She was a woman fleeing a destiny that could tear the aristocracy apart. And the secret she carried in her hand would force the most calculated man in England to choose between his cold logic and a love that changed everything. London. December 31st. The city was a glittering trap of lantern light, expensive champagne, and the deafening roar of celebration. Snow had turned the cobblestones into a treacherous white mirror, reflecting the flickering orange glow of the New Year's Eve festivities in Berkeley Square. Sir Edric Woottone stood amidst the chaos like a statue of salt. Tall, lean, and wrapped in a black Victorian overcoat that felt more like a suit of armor than clothing, Edric had only one goal for the evening: to endure the sentimental madness of humanity and return to the silence of his library. Edric lived by a mathematical certainty. He had even made a formal resolution for the coming year: avoid the frivolities of the heart. Never let a woman disrupt his ordered life. And under no circumstances allow a spark of life to touch his frozen world. By 11:58 p.m., he was convinced he had succeeded. But fate has a way of mocking those who think they are in control. Just a few paces behind him, near the scent of roasted chestnuts and winter pine, a young woman in a rich burgundy velvet cloak began to sway. Her pale complexion turned ghostly in the moonlight. Her eyes fluttered shut. And before the first firework could streak across the sky, she collapsed straight into the Duke's protective arms. In that breathless moment, Edric believed he was merely performing a duty for a stranger in distress. He didn't notice the gold pendant clutched in her delicate hand. He didn't know that she was a woman on the run from a powerful shadow. What he didn't realize as he looked down at her fragile features was that his resolution hadn't just been broken. It had been shattered. And by the time the first sun of the new year rose, the man of stone would find himself tethered to a secret that would either save them both or destroy his world forever. The first explosion of light shattered the midnight sky just as Edric reached the edge of the square. It was a brilliant, violent burst of crimson and gold that painted the falling snow in hues of fire. Below, the crowd erupted in a cacophony of cheers, but the sound only made Edric tighten his jaw. He adjusted his gloves, his gaze fixed on the line of waiting carriages. He was so close to the sanctuary of silence, so close to upholding the resolution that felt more like a fortress than a promise. Then, the world shifted. A soft, jagged gasp cut through the thunder of the fireworks. It was a sound of absolute exhaustion, thin and desperate. Edric turned, his instincts as a hunter surfacing before his logic could intervene. Just a few feet away, a figure stumbled through the swirling white flakes. She looked like a drop of blood spilled upon the pristine snow, her heavy cloak of burgundy velvet trailing behind her like a broken wing. She didn't cry out. She simply tilted, her strength vanishing as if a thread had been cut. Edric moved. He didn't think of the scandal, the physical contact, or the mud that would surely ruin his bespoke overcoat. He lunged forward, his long stride eating the distance just as her knees gave way. He caught her with a jarring impact, his strong arms locking around her waist and shoulders before she could strike the frozen cobblestones. The woman was a fragile weight in his arms, her head falling back against his shoulder. Up close, the richness of her velvet cloak was startling against her deathly pale skin. Her dark, wavy hair had escaped its pins, spilling over his black sleeve like silk shadows. "Steady now," Edric commanded, his voice a low rumble that felt foreign even to his own ears. She didn't answer. Her eyes remained closed, her long lashes casting delicate shadows over her cheeks. It was then that he saw it, clutched so tightly in her small, gloved hand that the knuckles were white. A gold pendant swung rhythmically on a broken chain, a noble crest engraved into its surface catching the flickering light of the dying fireworks. Edric froze. He recognized the symbols etched in that gold, a lineage that had no business being found fainted in a public square at midnight. The protective instinct he had spent years suppressing flared into a white-hot heat. He looked down at her face, captivated by the vulnerability of a woman who appeared to have run until her very heart gave out. The fireworks faded, leaving the square in a sudden, heavy silence punctuated only by the distant chime of church bells. The new year had begun. Edric looked at the woman, then at his carriage, and finally at the mathematical life he had planned. With a sharp, decisive breath, he adjusted his grip, lifting her securely against his chest. The resolution was dead. The rescue had begun. The carriage ride to Northmore House was a blur of silver moonlight and the rhythmic thud of hooves against the packed snow. Inside the dim cabin, the air was thick with the scent of pine and the faint, metallic tang of the winter frost clinging to Luella's velvet cloak. Edric sat rigid, the unconscious woman's head resting against his chest. He could feel the shallow, rapid flutter of her breath against his throat, a stark reminder of the humanity he had tried so hard to quantify and dismiss. When the carriage pulled into the sweeping drive of his estate, the house loomed like a silent sentinel of stone and shadow. Edric did not wait for the footman to lower the steps completely. He stepped out with Luella in his arms, her weight feeling more substantial with every passing second. He ignored the stunned expressions of his midnight staff as he strode through the grand foyer, his boots echoing sharply against the checkered marble. "Wake Mrs. Halloway," Edric commanded his butler, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the hall. "Prepare the blue suite. And fetch my personal physician immediately." He carried her into the warmth of the library, the one room in the house that didn't feel like a museum of dead ancestors. He lowered her onto the leather settee, his movements uncharacteristically gentle. As the firelight caught her features, the stark paleness of her skin seemed to glow against the deep burgundy of her dress. It was then that he noticed her hand had finally relaxed. The gold pendant she had been clutching slid from her palm, dangling over the edge of the velvet cushions. Edric reached out, his gloved fingers catching the cool metal. He brought it closer to the firelight, his breath hitching as the flickering flames illuminated the engraving. It wasn't a mere decorative trinket. It was an ancient seal, a crown entwined with thorns and a rising phoenix. It was the crest of the House of Winter, a lineage that had vanished from the social registers of London years ago under a cloud of political whispers and sudden disappearances. This was no merchant's daughter caught in the cold. This was a high-born fugitive carrying the weight of a fallen dynasty in her hand. The Duke looked from the crest to the woman's face, a new kind of tension tightening his chest. He had spent his life avoiding complications, but as he looked at Luella Winter, he realized that he hadn't just rescued a stranger. He had invited a storm into his sanctuary, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to seek shelter from it. He tucked the pendant into his waistcoat pocket, the gold feeling heavy against his heart, as the distant chime of the hallway clock marked the first hour of a year that would change everything. The heavy oak doors of the library creaked open as Dr. Sterling entered, his medical bag clutched in a weathered hand. The fire had settled into a low, rhythmic hum, casting long, dancing shadows across Luella's still form. Edric stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the frost-patterned glass. He didn't turn when the doctor approached the settee, but his shoulders remained tight, a physical manifestation of the silence that gripped the room. For several minutes, the only sounds were the soft clink of glass vials and the doctor's steady, rhythmic breathing as he performed his examination. Edric watched in the reflection of the windowpane, his mind racing with the image of the phoenix crest now hidden in his pocket. He was a man who dealt in certainties, yet everything about this woman was a question mark written in burgundy velvet. "She is stable, Your Grace," Sterling finally spoke, his voice raspy with age and the late hour. He straightened up, wiping his spectacles with a handkerchief. "But I must be plain with you. This is not a simple case of the winter vapors or a delicate constitution. Edric turned then, his refined features etched with a rare flicker of unease. What is it, then? She is suffering from profound physical and nervous exhaustion, the doctor explained, gesturing toward Luella's pale, translucent hand. Her pulse is thready, and her respirations are far too shallow. It is as if she has been sustained by nothing but sheer will and adrenaline for weeks. She hasn't just walked through a fair, Edric, she has been running. Running until her body simply refused to take another step. Edric looked down at her. In the soft light, the dark circles beneath her eyes were more prominent, a stark contrast to her delicate, aristocratic features. Running from what? That is a question for a magistrate or a priest, not a physician, Sterling replied, snapping his bag shut with a finality that echoed in the quiet room. But mark my words. She is in a state of extreme depletion. If she is forced to move or face any further shock before she recovers her strength, her heart may not withstand the strain. She needs absolute quiet, warmth, and, above all, the feeling of safety. Whatever she was fleeing, it has nearly cost her her life. The doctor paused at the door, glancing back at the Duke. She is a fugitive of some sort, isn't she? The way her hand twitches even in sleep, she's bracing for a blow that hasn't landed yet. Edric didn't answer. He waited until the doctor's footsteps faded down the hall before returning to the side of the settee. He looked at the woman who had shattered his New Year's resolution with a single collapse. She was a stranger, a potential scandal, and a high-born fugitive all at once. According to his rules, he should have sent her to a hospital or contacted the authorities. Instead, he reached out, his gloved hand hovering for a second before he tucked the heavy velvet cloak more securely around her shoulders. He thought of the crest and the doctor's warning. She had run until she fell, and she had fallen into the arms of a man who had sworn never to care. "You are safe here," he whispered, the words feeling heavy and strange in the empty library. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Northmore wasn't counting the minutes until he could be alone. He was counting the heartbeats of the woman who had brought the world crashing into his sanctuary. The first light of the new year did not arrive with a celebratory roar, but as a pale, hesitant silver filtering through the heavy velvet curtains of the blue suite. Edric had not slept. He sat in a high-backed wing chair near the hearth, his cravat loosened and his eyes fixed on the woman in the bed. He was watching for the exact moment the shadows of exhaustion would lift, and when they finally did, the transformation was electric. Luella's eyes snapped open, not with the sluggish confusion of a typical patient, but with the sharp, panicked clarity of a bird sensing a predator. She was upright in an instant, her breath hitching as she clawed at the fine silk sheets. Her gaze swept the opulence of the room, landing finally on the Duke. "You are at Northmore House," Edric said, his voice a calm anchor in the quiet room. "You collapsed at the square. You are safe." Luella did not relax. She pulled the covers higher, her pale knuckles trembling, yet her chin rose with a defiance that surprised him. "Safety is a relative term in London, Your Grace. Especially when one wakes in the home of a man known for his mathematical lack of mercy." Edric arched a dark brow. He had not expected her to know his reputation, nor to wield it against him so quickly. "My mercy may be calculated, but it is currently at your disposal. You were nearly a corpse by the time the fireworks ended. Dr. Sterling says you've run yourself into a state of physical ruin." "Doctors are prone to melodrama," she countered, her voice raspy but steady. She scanned the bedside table, her eyes widening. "My pendant. Where is it?" Edric reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced the gold phoenix. He didn't hand it over immediately, instead, he let it catch the morning light. "It is quite a weight to carry. A crest of a house that hasn't existed in the peerage for a decade. Tell me, Lady Luella, if that is indeed your name, does one usually flee from ghosts, or from the people who turned your family into them?" A flicker of vulnerability crossed her face, gone as quickly as a candle blown out in a gale. She reached out, her hand steady despite her pallor. A duke should know better than to ask questions he isn't prepared to pay for. My name is my own. My business is even more so. And yet, Edric said, leaning forward, the distance between them suddenly charged with a strange, magnetic tension, you fainted into my arms. By the laws of gravity and social scandal, your business became mine at midnight. Luella looked at him then, really looked at him, searching the refined, aristocratic lines of his face for a hint of the cruelty she clearly expected. What she found instead was a man who looked as though he had just discovered a new element and was terrified by its brilliance. I have no money to pay for your silence, she whispered, her wit momentarily failing her as she realized the gravity of her position. I don't want your money, Edric replied, finally placing the pendant in her palm. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, searing contact that made his heart hammer against his ribs, a sensation no ledger had ever provoked. I want to know why a woman with the fire of a phoenix in her eyes looks as though she's waiting for the world to end. Luella clutched the gold to her chest, her gaze locking with his. In that silent exchange, the Duke of Northmore realized his quiet, orderly life was truly over. He was captivated not by her beauty, but by the sheer, stubborn will of a woman who was broken but refused to shatter. The battle of wits had only just begun, and for the first time in his life, Edric didn't care if he lost. The morning sun climbed higher, casting the shadow of the window frame across the silk duvet like the bars of a golden cage. Luella sat back against the pillows, her fingers tracing the intricate lines of the phoenix crest with a reverence that bordered on resentment. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, muffled sounds of a household waking to a new year. You speak of this as a ghost, Edric said softly, his gaze never leaving her face. But ghosts do not cause a woman to run until her heart falters. Ghosts do not require a gold seal of passage. Luella looked up, her dark eyes clouded with a weary sort of wisdom. In my world, your grace, the line between the living and the dead is drawn in ink and gold. This pendant is the last remnant of the House of Winter. To you, it is a curiosity of the peerage. To me, it is an inheritance and a cage. She held the coin up, the light catching the sharp beak of the rising bird. My father was a man who believed that blood was a currency to be spent on political leverage. Before he died, he brokered a deal. A union intended to tether our family's remaining influence to a man whose shadow is longer than his reach. I was the collateral. This crest was to be the signature on my own bill of sale. Edric felt a cold tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter air. He understood the mechanics of such arrangements, he had seen them play out in the ballrooms of Mayfair 1,000 times. But seeing the marks of that burden on her, the hollow of her throat, the tremor in her hands, made the practice seem suddenly, violently grotesque. I spent years trying to leave the name behind, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. I lived in the shadows of the countryside, changed my manners, hid my face. I wanted to be no one. But a phoenix is a difficult thing to bury. The man my father chose, Lord Vane, has spent the last 6 months scouring the coast for this missing asset. He does not want a wife, he wants the lands and the secrets that this pendant unlocks. And the collapse? Edric asked, stepping closer to the bed. I reached London yesterday. I thought the crowds of the new year would be my sanctuary, a place to vanish forever. But I saw his men near the square. I realized then that no matter how far I ran, the gold around my neck acted like a tether, pulling me back to a life I never chose. She looked at him with a sudden, sharp intensity. I am a fugitive from a contract, Duke. To help me is to invite the wrath of a man who views me as his legal property. It is a mathematical error you cannot afford. Edric looked at the gold pendant, then back at the woman who wore its weight so bravely. He thought of his ledgers, his rules, and the quiet safety of his previous life. Then he looked at the defiance in her eyes, a fire that refused to be extinguished even in the face of ruin. "I have never been particularly fond of Lord Vane's mathematics," Edric said, his voice regaining its cool, aristocratic edge, though his eyes burned with a new purpose. "And I find that I am suddenly very interested in the secrets of the Phoenix." Luella let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since midnight. For the first time, the cage didn't feel quite so small, even if the gold still felt just as heavy. The days that followed were marked by a silence that no longer felt empty, but expectant. Snow continued to fall outside the tall library windows, draping the London gardens in a thick, insulating white that seemed to wall the estate off from the rest of the world. Inside, the hearth fire was never allowed to die. Luella had migrated from the sickbed to the library, tucked into a velvet armchair surrounded by towers of first editions. She was reading a volume on ancient architecture, her dark hair gathered loosely at the nape of her neck, a few stray curls framing a face that was finally regaining its bloom. Across the room, Edric sat at his mahogany desk, his ledgers open before him. For the first time in a decade, the numbers refused to align. His mind, usually a precision instrument of logic, was preoccupied with the rhythmic turning of her pages and the way the firelight caught the gold of the pendant resting against her collarbone. He looked up, pen poised mid-air, and found her watching him with a quiet, knowing smile. "You've been staring at that same column for 20 minutes, Your Grace," she noted, her voice a gentle tease that sent a strange, warm tingle down his spine. "I fear I am a terrible distraction to your mathematical order." Edric set the pen down, the ink drying forgotten on the nib. The order was overrated, he admitted, the honesty of it surprising him. "It turns out that a house governed entirely by rules is a very quiet place to grow old." "Rules are safety," Luella said, her expression softening. "I of all people understand the desire to build a fortress. But even the strongest walls can feel like a tomb if you never open the windows." Edric stood and walked toward the fire, leaning one arm against the mantel. He looked at her, not as a duke observing a patient, but as a man seeing a future he hadn't known he wanted. His life had been a series of calculated distances. Avoiding gossip, avoiding scandal, avoiding the messy, unpredictable depths of another person. He had called it discipline. Standing here now, he realized it was simply fear. Every rule he had crafted to protect his heart was now an obstacle keeping him from her. If he followed his code, he would find her a safe house in the country, settle a stipend upon her, and return to his solitary ledgers. He would be safe, and he would be miserable. "The doctor says you are nearly recovered," Edric said, his voice dropping to a low, husky register. "He mentioned that in another day or two, you might be fit for travel." Luella's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around the edge of her book. The mention of leaving hung in the air like a cold draft. "Yes. I suppose I should begin making arrangements. I cannot impose upon your hospitality, or your reputation, indefinitely." Edric looked into the flames, the heat reflecting in his dark eyes. The thought of the library returning to its previous silence, the thought of the blue suite being empty once more, was suddenly intolerable. He realized then that he didn't just want to save her from Lord Vane. He wanted to save himself from the person he had been before she fainted into his arms. "Don't," he said, turning to look at her. The word was a command, but it held the vulnerability of a plea. "Don't go. Not yet." The air between them thickened, the mathematical Duke finally surrendering to the beautiful, chaotic variables sitting in his library. The thaw had begun, and as Luella looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes, Edric knew there was no going back to the cold. The fragile piece of Northmore House shattered with a sound that Edric had subconsciously been bracing for since midnight on New Year's Eve. It was not a polite rap of a visitor, but a heavy, rhythmic thundering against the front oak doors that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the library. Luella froze, her book slipping from her lap to the carpet with a dull thud. The color drained from her face, leaving her eyes like dark pools of terror. Edric was on his feet instantly, his hand hovering near her shoulder in a silent promise of protection. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice dropping into the low, dangerous tone of a man who had spent his life commanding respect. "Do not move from this room." He strode into the grand foyer just as his butler, Miller, was drawing back the heavy iron bolts. The cold winter air rushed in, bringing with it a swirl of sleet and the looming presence of 3 men. At the center stood Lord Vane, a man whose elegance was as sharp and predatory as a razor. He was dressed in furs that smelled of damp earth and tobacco, his eyes scanning the Duke's hall with a proprietary coldness. "Duke of Northmore," Vane said, his voice a smooth, oily drawl that made Edric's skin crawl. "A bit late for New Year's calls, I admit. But I believe you are in possession of something that belongs to me." Edric stepped forward, his tall frame blocking the path to the library. He did not offer a greeting, he did not offer the warmth of his hearth. He stood like a wall of granite. "Lord Vane. To what do I owe this intrusion? My house is not a lost and found for your misplaced property." Vane's smile did not reach his eyes. He reached into his pocket and produced a crumpled document, the legal marriage contract signed by Luella's father. "Let us not play games, Edric." A woman in a burgundy cloak was seen entering these gates. A woman carrying a very specific gold crest. "She is my ward, my betrothed, and by the laws of this land, she is my responsibility. You are harboring a fugitive, and the scandal of such a thing would be catastrophic for a man of your standing." Behind Vane, his 2 hired men shifted, their hands resting near their heavy coats. The scandal Edric had spent years meticulously avoiding was no longer a distant threat, it was standing in his doorway, breathing the cold air of ruin into his home. If he handed her over, his life would remain ordered and perfect. If he refused, he would be declaring war on the very society that gave him his power. "I suggest you choose your next words carefully," Vane hissed, stepping closer until the scent of his cloying cologne filled the space between them. "Give her to me, and we shall say she was merely confused by the cold. Refuse, and I will ensure that by dawn, the name Northmore is synonymous with the abduction of a noble lady." Edric felt the weight of the gold pendant in his own pocket, a secret heat against his thigh. He thought of Luella trembling in the library, and then he thought of his rules. For the first time, the thought of a scandal didn't feel like a disaster, it felt like the price of his soul. "My next words are quite simple, Vane," Edric said, his voice echoing with a chilling authority that made even the hired men recoil. "Get off my steps before I have my hounds show you the way to the gate. My house is a sanctuary, and you are not invited." The heavy thud of the door closing against Lord Vane did not signal the end of the battle, it only signaled the start of a much deeper war. Edric stood in the sudden, ringing silence of the foyer, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that no ledger or mathematical certainty could explain. Through the thick oak, he could still hear Vane's muffled threats. Vows of social ruin, of legal action, and of a scandal that would burn the Northmore name to ash by morning. "Your Grace?" Miller, the butler, whispered, his face as pale as the marble floor. "The authorities, the scandal, what shall we do?" Edric didn't answer. He turned and strode back into the library. Luella was standing by the window, her hands pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with the terror of a trapped animal. She had heard it all. "You have to let me go," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "He is right. If you keep me here, they will destroy you. You are a duke of the realm, Edric. You cannot trade your entire life for a woman you found in the snow." Edric crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping only when he was inches from her. The logic of his old life screamed at him to listen. Every rule he had ever lived by offered him an easy exit. Call a carriage, hand her over, and reclaim the peace of his solitude. He could return to his books and his silence, and the world would never need to know he had almost cared. "My rules were designed to keep the world out," Edric said, his voice low and vibrating with a sudden, fierce clarity. But I realized tonight that they were also keeping me in. I have spent my life guarding a reputation that is nothing but a hollow shell. Edric, please, she sobbed, the cost is too high. Then I shall pay it, he countered. He reached out, his gloved fingers gently tilting her chin upward until she was forced to see the fire in his eyes. I am not hiding you because I have to. I am hiding you because I choose to. For the first time in my life, I am making a decision that isn't based on a calculation of risk, but on the simple fact that I cannot imagine this house, or this heart, without you in it. He didn't wait for her to argue. He led her toward the back of the library, to a section of shelving that looked like any other. With a practiced click of a hidden spring, the wood swung inward, revealing a narrow, stone passage that led to the older, more fortified section of the estate. Miller will bring you food and blankets, Edric told her as he guided her into the shadows of the secret room. Vane will return with the watch, and I will meet them at the gate. I will tell them you fled into the night. I will lie, I will cheat, and I will break every law of the ton to ensure you remain safe. He stepped back, his hand resting on the edge of the hidden door. For a man who had lived by rigid lines and cold facts, the act of officially breaking was the most liberating moment of his life. Why? She whispered from the darkness of the passage. Edric looked at her one last time before the door closed. Because a phoenix belongs in the sky, Luella. Not in a cage. And I find I would rather burn with you than live in the cold alone. The door clicked shut, sealing her away. Edric straightened his coat, wiped the trace of emotion from his face, and walked toward the front of the house to meet the ruin he had so gladly chosen. The lanterns flickering in the foyer cast long, trembling shadows against the marble as the heavy thud of the door sounded again. This time, when Edric opened it, he was met not just by Lord Vane, but by a captain of the local watch and several men carrying the official authority of the crown. The winter wind howled into the hall, tasting of salt and impending ruin. Your Grace, the captain began, his voice hesitant as he looked into the cold, unwavering eyes of the Duke. Lord Vane has filed a formal complaint. He claims you are withholding a ward of the state, a lady of the House of Winter. Against her will and legal obligation. Edric stepped onto the threshold, his tall, lean frame cutting a silhouette of absolute, terrifying authority. He did not look at the captain, his gaze was fixed on Vane, who stood behind the officers with a smug, expectant sneer. A ward of the state. Edric's voice was like a low roll of thunder, perfectly controlled and chillingly calm. Lord Vane, you speak of legal obligations as if they were gospel, yet you stand on my doorstep at midnight like a common thief. If you believe there is a woman of noble birth within these walls, then you are calling me a kidnapper. Are you prepared to stake your title on that accusation before the House of Lords? Vane's smile faltered. The Duke's aristocratic mask was flawless, a wall of social power that few men in England dared to climb. I saw her, Northmore. The burgundy cloak. The pendant. She is here. I have spent my evening as I spend every new year, Edric replied, stepping down one stair, forcing the watchman to retreat. In the company of my thoughts and my ledgers. If a woman in a red cloak wandered past my gates, she is long gone into the fog. But let us be clear about what is happening now. Edric turned his gaze to the captain of the watch. You are standing on the private property of a peer of the realm without a warrant signed by the High Magistrate. You are here on the word of a man who is known for his gambling debts and his desperate need for an heiress's dowry. If you cross this threshold, I will not only have you stripped of your commission, I will see every man here tried for trespassing against the crown. The captain took a half step back, the color draining from his face. The authority of the Duke was a physical force, far weightier than the flimsy contract Vane held in his gloved hand. And as for you, Vane, Edric said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Hear me well. This woman you hunt, this phoenix you wish to cage, is no longer a fugitive. She is under the protection of the House of Northmore. Any further pursuit of her, any whisper of her name in the clubs of Mayfair, or any attempt to lay a finger on her person will be treated as a personal declaration of war against me. I have the wealth to bury you and the influence to ensure you never hold a seat in this city again. You would ruin yourself for her?" Vane hissed, though he was backing toward his carriage. "I would burn the world to ash to keep her safe from a man like you," Edric countered. "Now, get off my land. The new year has begun, and in my world, your time has officially run out." With a sharp wave of his hand, Edric signaled his footmen. The heavy iron gates of the estate swung shut with a final, metallic clang, locking the cold world out. Edric stood alone in the dark for a moment, his chest heaving. He had used his power, his name, and his status as weapons, not to preserve his order, but to destroy it for the sake of a woman hiding in the shadows of his library. He was a duke no longer bound by rules, and as he turned back toward the house, he had never felt more like a man. The following year arrived not with a sense of impending disaster, but with a profound, quiet warmth that filled the halls of Northmore House. Outside, London was once again a tapestry of white and gold, the snow falling in gentle, silent flakes that dusted the windowsill of the Duke's private study. Inside, the hearth glowed with a steady fire, reflecting off the spines of leather-bound books that no longer felt like a fortress of solitude. Edric stood by the window, a glass of dark amber brandy in one hand, though his attention was far from the drink. He was watching the reflection in the glass. Luella, draped in a gown of soft cream silk that shimmered like moonlight, was seated in the very armchair where she had once fought him with her wit and guarded secrets. She was no longer the fragile fugitive who had collapsed in the mud. There was a grace in her shoulders and a peace in her eyes that made his chest ache with a fierce, protective pride. The first distant boom of the midnight fireworks echoed across the square. Edric turned as Luella stood, joining him at the glass. He set his drink aside and wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her fingers interlaced with his. The gold phoenix pendant, now worn openly as a symbol of a reclaimed name, catching the light of the pyrotechnics blooming over the city. "A year ago today," Luella whispered, her voice like velvet, "I thought my life ended on those cobblestones. I thought the cold had finally won." Edric pressed a kiss to her temple, the scent of winter pine and her lavender perfume filling his senses. "And I thought my life was perfectly ordered," he replied with a soft, self-deprecating laugh. "I was a man who lived by rules and resolutions, convinced that safety lay in silence. I looked at you that night and saw the destruction of everything I had built." He turned her in his arms as a brilliant burst of emerald light illuminated the room. "I was right, in a way. You did destroy that world. You shattered my logic, ruined my reputation, and turned my sanctuary into a battlefield." Luella smiled, that brilliant, unreserved smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. "Do you regret the scandal, Edric? The loss of your mathematical peace?" Edric looked at her, truly seeing the woman who had taught him that the most beautiful things in life are the ones that cannot be calculated. He thought of the worst night of his life, the panic, the cold, the confrontation at the gate, and realized it had been the catalyst for his only true beginning. "I regret only the years I spent before you fainted into my arms," he said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute sincerity. "I have discovered that I would rather be ruined with you than be a duke in a world without your fire. My worst night became the foundation of my best life." As the clock struck 12, signaling the birth of another year, they didn't look at the fireworks. They looked at each other, two souls who had found a home in the middle of a storm. The Duke of Northmore, the man who had once feared the chaos of the heart, finally understood that the best moments are the ones you never planned for. In the warmth of their shared embrace, they welcomed a future that was no longer a secret to be kept, but a love to be lived.